started today, I'm going to actually read a quote to you from Mr. Mark Twain. He said this about teenagers. He said, when they're 13, put them in a barrel and nail the lid shut, then feed them through the knothole. When they're 16, plug the knothole. Sounds like Mr. Twain had some issues with some teenagers at some point in his life, right? Or maybe what he needed were some guardrails for parenting. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. We're going to talk about guardrails when it comes to parenting. Now, I know when I say that, some of you are like, I don't have children, or I don't ever want to have children, or all my children are gone. I just want you to not tune me out, because a lot of what we're going to talk about today, I think, is helpful in all of our lives. Yes, we're going to focus on parenting, but I just want you to stay with me. Don't tune me out, because there's some good stuff in here for us. Now, if this is your first time here for the series, we're talking about guardrails. You might be like, what are you talking about? Well, we know what guardrails are, right? They're those barriers that go between the road and sort of those danger spots off the road. And they put those in place so that we don't go over the edge, right? So that we don't fall off the cliff, so we don't fall off the hill, fall into the river. We're kind of using that as a word picture for ourselves. Then in our lives, we have a lot of painted lines. And those painted lines say, hey, you can cross anytime you want, but if you cross, you're going to end up in these danger areas. We want to put barriers in place. We want to put guardrails in place so that we can make sure we can be where God has created us to be, so we don't find ourselves in those areas that are dangerous to us, in whatever area of life that might be. Now, for us, we've talked about work already. Last week, Joel talked about toxic relationships. This week, we're going to talk about parenting. Well, let me tell you where parenting begins. It begins with pre-parenting. What is pre-parenting? Pre-parenting is the parenting we do before we become parents, right? Here's what pre-parenting looks like. You are out and about. You are eating dinner somewhere. You're out shopping. You're at the grocery store. And you see a family with their kids, or you see a parent with their kids, you're like, can't they control their child? Their child's loud and crying and screaming. They're throwing a tantrum. Or you're in a restaurant, right? And their child has a laptop, or not a laptop, but has an iPad, or has their phone out, and they're watching a show, or they're playing a video game. You're like, what are they doing? This is terrible for their kid to be doing this in the restaurant. And then we utter those famous lines, those famous words, when I'm a parent, I will never be like them. And then we become parents. We're at the grocery store, we're out to eat, we're shopping. We're like, why are these people looking at me? I'm doing everything I can to control my child. I don't know why they're screaming. I don't know why they're throwing a tantrum. We gave them that phone so that we can actually have an adult conversation while we are here eating. This parenting thing is actually really, really hard. And it seems like it's in that moment we kind of hit this time machine and we go back to BK, before kids. And we remind ourselves, oh, I remember what I said then, but what I realize is that parenting is hard. Well, it is hard. And then our kids begin to grow up, and we start to ask ourselves the question, am I a good parent? Or watch a TV show, and there's some issue that arises, and mom and dad just kind of swoop in, and disaster is averted. There's this perfect ending in 22 minutes if it's a sitcom, and 42 minutes if it's a drama, and we're like, they make it look so easy. Why is this so hard for me? Or we see parents with their kids out in the wild, and we begin to compare ourselves and our parenting skills to their parenting skills because their kids are calm and relaxed and quiet and perfect. And it's like, what's wrong with me? I must be a terrible parent. The reality is, parents, nothing is wrong with you. Parenting is hard. Parenting is tough. Parenting takes time. It takes effort. Parenting is a learning experience, whether your kids are just born or I think even into their 50s or 60s and you're still a parent. I mean, parenting is something that we were always learning. And no matter how good of a parent you might be, you're always going to question your parenting skills. I love this quote by Stuart Friedman and Alyssa Westring in their book, Parents Who Lead. They said, being a parent requires seemingly endless amounts of energy and patience, illuminates our shortcomings, and mystifies us at every turn. Does that sound about right, parents? Yeah, that sounds about right for me. But I want you to remember this, parents. Even though parenting is hard, parenting can be one of the most rewarding things that we do in our lives. But there's a part that's sort of tough about this statement because I heard someone say it this way not too long ago. They said, the days are long, but the years are short. The days are long, but the years are short. Our oldest was born back in 2002 in Trenton, New Jersey. I can remember the day she was born. I can remember everything that happened before she was born. I can remember the moment she was born. I can remember everything that happened after. I remember getting ready to take her home and wondering why nurses weren't going home with us for a few days to help us out. I remember the townhouse that looked like a bomb shelter that we lived in for a couple of years there. I remember taking her home to that. I remember her sleeping on my chest. I've shared that not too long ago because she was a terrible sleeper. I remember her playing in the snowstorms there in New Jersey. I remember when we first lived here in Virginia, out in the Haymarket area, that it was the day before her first day of kindergarten, and she fell off of a slide and broke her arm. And I remember that because I was in charge of her that day. Yeah, while Kara was in the hospital because she had just had our third, Jake. And I think about all these memories about our daughter, and I look at her now. She's married to a great guy named Andy. They just gave us our first grandkid, a grandson, a little over a month ago. And I come back to those words, the days are long, but the years are short. As a parent, how do we make sure the time we have with our kids is rewarding? How do we make sure that even though parenting is tough, we're giving it our best? I think it begins by understanding, what is our goal? Like, what is our goal as a parent? Well, if we say we're a follower of Christ, I think our goal is pretty simple. Our goal is to move our kids from dependence on us to dependence on God. That if we follow Christ, this should be what our goal is as a parent. But then the question is, how do we do that? Well, I think it begins with something that probably all of us are familiar with. It's this term leadership. Like, we know leadership, right? We read books on leadership. We listen to podcasts on leadership. We see leadership in the places that we work. We experience it in club sports and at home, just all around us. I mean, we are familiar with what leadership looks like and what it feels like. Now, it's not always perfect, but we know what leadership is. We go back to this book by Friedman and Westring. They wrote this. They say, leaders are those who see how to improve things and inspire people to pursue a better future together. I think this is what parenting is all about. Parenting is inspiring our kids to pursue a better future for them. And I would add into this, through this relationship with Jesus. Now, this doesn't mean we don't want them to be successful. It doesn't mean that we don't want them to work hard. It doesn't mean that we don't want them to be driven. What it means is we want the first thing in their life, the focus of their life, to be on Jesus. And all that other stuff that comes after that's just icing on the cake. But we want to see them be followers of Jesus first. We want to inspire them to that place. And that will only begin when we as parents are leading our children well. But what would that look like for us? Well, we're going to actually spend our time today in the book of Deuteronomy. And this is in the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, we find Moses, and he actually brings all the Israelites together. And as he brings the Israelites together, he shares with them, he kind of recaps his interaction with God and how God gave him the 10 commandments. Well, in this interaction, as he's talking to the Israelites, he actually goes back and he goes through those 10 commandments once again, which then leads us into Deuteronomy chapter 6, starting with verse 1. Here's what Moses says. These are the commands, decrees, and regulations that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you. You must obey them in the land you're about to enter and occupy, and you and your children and grandchildren must fear the Lord your God as long as you live. If you obey all his decrees and commands, you will enjoy a long life. Listen closely, Israel, and be careful to obey. Then all will go well with you, and you will have many children in the land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, promised you. Here is Moses, who back in chapter 5 recaps these 10 commandments. And then we find here in chapter 6, he says, these commands are for you. That you are to listen to these commands and you are to obey them. But notice what he says in verse 2. He says, these commands are for you and for your children and your grandchildren. Now, Moses is talking to all of Israel here, but as I read these words, it feels like there's this challenge that he is giving to parents. Like, parents, you are the starting point for these commandments. If you follow these commandments, if you follow God's rules, there's going to be this influence that's going to go beyond you. It's going to go to your kids. It's going to go to your grandkids and beyond them. It feels like Moses is setting some guardrails for parents, right? Again, if you follow these rules, it's going to keep you out of the danger zone. And not only is it going to keep you out of the danger zone, but if you teach these to your kids, if they follow them too, it's going to keep them out of those dangerous places in their lives also. But as we read this, it feels like Moses begins to give some concrete steps to how to actually do this. Look at verse 4. Listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Do you remember the first prayer you ever learned as a kid? Is probably instilled in your mind even to this day. I want to read one that you're probably familiar with, maybe even prayed it as a kid, but I want to put a little mood music behind it to kind of get us started. So they're going to get that music on here. You guys are used to that when you were a kid, right? Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Hush, little baby, don't say a word. And never mind that noise you heard. Yeah, that's good. All right. Some of you are probably familiar with the first part. You're like, I don't know that second part. If your parents were Metallica fans, you probably would know that second part there. My point being, there's something about that first prayer that we learn that just sticks with us our whole life. These words that Moses speaks here in verse 4, they're a powerful statement, but they also become the part of the beginning of a prayer. This prayer is known as the Shema. Now, the Hebrew word for Shema is the word here. In this translation, it's the word listen there. The Shema was a prayer that was about 3 paragraphs long that you would learn, that you would recite it. You would actually do this in the morning when you woke up and in the evening when you would go to bed. And so you would that would become this constant to you. In fact, some of what we're going to read through this morning is part of the Shema. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details there. If you want to know more about those 3 paragraphs, you can go back and look that up. But when you were a child, the very first prayer that you learned was this last part of this passage here. The Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And so this was the first prayer that you would learn. And you would pray this prayer in the morning when you got up, and you would pray it at night when you would go to bed. Now, why were these words important to the Israelites, and why were they important for children to know? The actual words of this prayer, the beginning of this prayer, are Yahweh our God, Yahweh one. This was a reminder to the Israelites that God and God alone was to be their focus in life, the center of their life, the leader of their life. Now remember, they had come out of Egypt. And in Egypt, they had been slaves there for about 400 years. And Egypt was a polytheistic society. And so some of that polytheism had actually kind of infiltrated the Israelite faith. And so here is Moses who's saying, hey, you got to forget that past. You got to forget what you learned there in Egypt or what you experienced in Egypt. You have got to come back and focus on God alone. There is one and only one God. If you notice here, this prayer is not about homes or cars or jobs or promotions or kids' activities. It's all about the worship the affection, the allegiance that was supposed to be focused on God. Because for Israel, God was central to everything. But what does this mean for you and me today? Well, to lead our children well, I think it starts with ourselves. Guardrail number one for parenting, I would say, is make God the leader of your life. And again, this is true for all of us, but since we're talking about parenting here, if you're trying to wonder, you're trying to figure out, is this where I am? Is God the leader of my life? Maybe you ask yourself a couple of questions. Questions that are connected to your kids. Questions like, do my kids know my faith is important to me? Do my kids see me living out my faith on a regular basis? And maybe you're like, yeah, they see this. Well, let me take this a little bit deeper for us. Ask yourself this question: would I want my kids to live out the faith they're seeing from me? That's a little bit different question to answer. Or maybe ask your kids, hey, kids, tell me what you see is most important to me. And hopefully they would come back like, hey, it's Jesus, it's your faith. But for how many of us would it be? It's your work, it's education, it's possessions, it's sports. I'm afraid for too many of us as parents who say we're followers of Christ, that Jesus isn't actually the most important thing to us. And understand, sometimes our kids know us better than we maybe know ourselves. Let me remind you of this, parents. Whatever is most important to you will most likely become most important to your kids. And just thinking about that should make us pause and kind of ponder where we are in our lives. Multiple times throughout my years of ministry, I've had the parents come up to me and like, hey, my kid doesn't, want to follow Jesus, doesn't believe in God, doesn't want to go to church, what's going on? And what I want to say, have you looked at yourself lately, right? Like, have you looked at yourself? Have you looked at your faith patterns? Have you looked at the life you've been living? Because parents, whoever we are, our kids will follow in our footsteps. And so maybe, parents, it's time for us to reassess our faith and ask ourselves that question: what is most important to me? And if it's not God, ask ourselves why. And maybe the starting point for us is to go back to that prayer that we had there, Yahweh, or God, Yahweh one. Maybe that's a prayer that you and I need to pray on a consistent basis over and over and over again. Because remember, what is our goal? Our goal, if we're a follower of Christ, is to move our kids from dependence on us to dependence on God. And that starts with you and I making sure God is the leader of our lives. Well, how do we do that? I think that leads us into guardrail number 2. We've got to lead spiritually. Look at verse 5 here. Moses says, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. And you must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these commands that I am giving you today. When God is the leader of our lives, or when we're striving towards that, it takes effort to get to that place. Moses here, I feel like he's expanding on verse 4. He's like, hey, you can pray this prayer. You can say God is central. You can say God is the focus of your life. But this only happens when you love God fully, when you love God with all of who you are. Moses uses a few words here. He talks about the heart, the soul, and strength. In those days, your heart was regarded as the mind. It was your range of emotions. Your soul was your source of life. It was your vitality. It was your being. Your strength was the effort that you put in. And so for the Jewish people, they said, hey, my faith is holistic, right? It wasn't like you got faith here and you got work here and you got family here and you got hobbies here. I mean, every part of you in the Jewish faith is this holistic approach. It's all together, mind, soul, and strength. And as I read through what Moses says here, maybe this is what we need to. That when it comes to our faith, we need to look at it as this holistic piece, that we're given all of who we are to God. Not just 3/4, not just 1/8, but we're given all of us to God. In our mind, in our heart, in our soul, in our strength. I mean, that's a question for all of us to ask. Are we giving all of ourselves to God? Are we giving our heart, soul, and mind and our strength over to God? Are we making God the leader of our life by giving all of ourselves to God. And how do we do that? What would that look like? Well, I'm going to give you the churchiest church answer right now. It's all about spiritual disciplines. It's all about finding that time to spend together with God ourselves. Now, I know, I think in the Christian world today, we get kind of bored easily. And so we're like, what's new? There's got to be something better out there. Well, there's not, right? This has been happening for about 2,000 years where people have been working through these spiritual disciplines, and it is the best way to connect with God. It's the best way for us to grow spiritually. It's the best way for us to make sure that God is the leader of our lives. Richard Foster, in his book, Celebration of Discipline, said, neither should we think of the spiritual disciplines as some dull drudgery aimed at exterminating laughter from the face of the earth. Right? Sometimes that's what we feel about the spiritual disciplines, right? It feels like drudgery. It feels like a pain. It feels like something that's just mundane and boring. Now, there's new tech out there. You can actually have somebody tell the Bible to you, right? They will read the Bible to you. They get apps that do that. You can do daily devotionals. You can do all these different aspects of it, but it really connects back to those spiritual disciplines. It connects back to these basics, these fundamentals when it comes to spiritual growth. John Fontenot, in his book, Life Hacking Spiritual Disciplines, said the point with the spiritual disciplines is that they cause our minds and bodies and souls to be refocused on God. If that's happening, then you're doing them right. Kind of sounds like what Moses was saying here in Deuteronomy. What are some of these disciplines? I mean, you know these, right? Spend time in Scripture on a consistent daily basis. Maybe you're like, I've never read the Bible before, and I don't know where to start, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time. I'm going to give you some advice. Go to Proverbs. It's in the Old Testament. Every verse is a proverb. You can read one verse a day, and if you read that, I think there's, 30 chapters there, and multiply that, I don't know how many chapters there are. That's a lot of days that you're going to have covered throughout the year, right? Spend time reading Scripture. And if it's just a verse a day, Proverbs is full of wisdom. It's full of family wisdom and parenting wisdom and work wisdom and personal wisdom. Just spend time reading a proverb a day, or go somewhere else. Go to the New Testament. Read about the life of Jesus. Read a section at a time. Read a chapter at a time, whatever it may be for you. But there's something about spending time in Scripture that's so important. You get that app, listen to someone read it to you. Maybe it's Samuel L. Jackson. I think he has one. If you like his voice, listen to that, right? But there's something about that. Just spending time in Scripture is so important to us. But so is prayer. So is taking the time every single day to pray. Even if it's just for a moment. Maybe you're like, I've never prayed before. What am I supposed to do? I don't know these big theological words. You don't need to have big theological words. Just use your voice. Just say a prayer. You're like, man, I'm mad at God. Well, you know what? God doesn't mind mad prayers. God can handle your language and how upset you are and your frustrations. There's all these people in the Bible that have these frustrations and they have anger towards God and they let God know it. And God seems to be like, all right, let's work through this together. But take time in prayer on a daily basis. Being here, worshiping, right? That goes back to what Moses says here, the importance of prayer, the importance of being together and grouped together. There's something about you and I together on a Sunday morning in this place that's so powerful. And parents, let me just kind of throw this out there. If you don't make this a priority, don't ever expect your kids to make this a priority in their life. Again, it starts with us. So don't complain, well, my kid doesn't want to go to church. Well, maybe you need to look at yourself like, well, I don't really go to church either. That's why my kids don't want to go to church. There's something about being together that's so powerful and so important. There's relationships. That's why we try to get you in groups. Again, it's a great spiritual discipline, serving, whether here in the community, your neighborhood, your work, wherever it may be, serving other people. There's solitude, there's fasting, there's generosity. There's so many spiritual disciplines that we can put into place. And here's what's going to happen when we do those. You and I, we're going to begin to grow spiritually. And when you and I grow spiritually, guess what happens then? God becomes the leader of our lives. But you're like, how does this connect with parenting? There's a reward when we live our lives this way. And it connects us back to what Moses said at the beginning of Deuteronomy 6. As we grow spiritually, then we're going to begin to lead our kids spiritually. Well, you might be saying, well, how do I lead my kids spiritually as I'm growing spiritually? Well, this means guardrail number 3, that we lead them relationally. Look what Moses says, verse 7. Repeat them again and again to your children. Talk about them when you're at home and when you're on the road, when you're going to bed and when you're getting up. Tie them to your hands and wear them on your forehead as reminders. Write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. I'm always amazed at people who climb Mount Everest. I don't know how they do it. I have zero desire to do it myself, but I am totally fascinated by people who say, that is my goal, to climb Mount Everest. Now, I love watching little documentaries about it. I love watching video clips, people stuck on the side of the mountain because there's 600 people there. I love watching the fake movies about it. I love it. There's just something about that. And so this week, as I was working on this message, I'm like, I'm going to go back and I'm going to look at some of the training regimens that you have to go through so you can climb Mount Everest. So I looked at a few companies, and every single company said it takes you a minimum of 9 months to prep to climb Mount Everest. But they added this caveat. They said, but you need to be in like the best shape of your life before you even begin in this training regimen, right? So you don't just show up one day and like, hey, I got 9 months. I'm going to get this done. You got to be in shape before you do this. And so I was reading up, what are the training regimen that you have to climb this mountain? Let me share some of the things you got to work on. There's aerobic training. I mean, that makes sense. There's specific strength exercises just for climbing that particular mountain. You got to work on your muscular endurance. There are climbing techniques, again, that are specific to Mount Everest that you need to learn. There's acclimation to higher elevation. And then for 8 to 12 weeks alone, you have to go through hypoxic conditioning. And add into that what I think is probably the hardest part, there's the mental training that you have to go through to prep for this, right? All to maybe get a chance, if the weather's just right, to climb to the top of this mountain, or like I just said, or to be stuck in this traffic jam on the mountain with hundreds of other people. But this training, what is it about? It's all about repetition. Like if you want to climb Mount Everest, you have to train over and over and over again in all of these different areas that I just shared with you, so that hopefully you'll get this opportunity to climb that mountain. What does that have to do with us and guardrails and parenting? Well, look at some of these words Moses uses here in these verses. Repeat them, talk about them, tie them, wear them, write them. These are not passive words, are they? These are action words. As I read this, I'm like, here's Moses is telling parents, these are the actions you need to take towards your kids. What does this mean? It means keep sharing these commandments with your children. Keep talking to your children about how to live them out. Keep training your kids over and over and over again to understand how God is supposed to be first in their life. Because here's the deal, parents. We have some skin in the game when it comes to our kids' faith. Now, I do think that in the church world, there is sort of this misunderstanding that the job of the church is to lead our kids spiritually, right? That's what the church's job is to do. As that great theologian Randy Jackson used to say, that's a no for me, dog, right? It's true. It's not our job here at the church to lead your kids spiritually. Our job here in the church is to come alongside of you as a parent as you lead them spiritually. How do we come alongside you with that? Well, we have Journey Kids for kids nursery through 6th grade, but our older group through preschool through 6th grade, every single week they go through this orange curriculum. So they get to watch a video that tells a Bible story and talks about the subject they're talking about. I think like for the older kids, elementary age, this month they're talking about self-control, which might be something we need to learn too, right? But our kids are learning that downstairs. And so they read scripture together, they talk about, they have activities that they do. But when you go pick them up here in about, 12, 15 minutes from now, when you get to that place, that doesn't mean their spiritual growth is over with, and you're going to bring them back next week, say, hey, continue to help my kids grow spiritually. It continues on with you as you leave. Here's how we come alongside of you. If you go to our Church Center app, and you go down to Journey Kids, and you click on Journey Kids, it's going to take you to our web page for kids, and you can actually go to our website and do this too. But it's going to go through exactly what they talked about this morning. And so, like for preschool, it's going to tell them what story. They're talking about Jonah today. So you can get a heads up like, hey, how was the story on Jonah today, right? There you go. There's a bottom line, like a main idea for the day. There's a memory verse for the month. And then there's some take-home stuff. For the elementary experience, it's the same kind of things. They're actually Proverbs today is their weekly Bible story. Too much of a good thing, right? You need to ask them, what's too much of a good thing? But it means know when to stop. Again, they're talking about self-control. But if you go to the elementary one, there's actually 5-day devotionals you can do with your kids. And so you can print those out in 5 days this week. Just kind of walk through that. And here's what we're doing. We're saying, hey, we're going to come alongside of you. We're going to give you some ways that you can do this. But parents, your job is to lead your kids spiritually. And we're going to come alongside of you as you do that. But we love that we are able to make that happen. But then you're like, well, I got teenagers. What am I supposed to do with my teenagers? Well, let me just kind of stop for a second, time out. I know we have, if you've been here a little bit, we've been looking for a full-time student pastor for some time. We're still looking. I don't have good news to give you right now, all right? But I told you when we started the process, it's really hard to find people in ministry at this time that we live in. So we're still looking. We're still working with an organization who's helping us. But just keep praying for that as we move forward with that hire. But if you got kids and Journey teens, tonight they're probably not going to come home with something or come home with a big old pumpkin. You're like, great, we're going to throw this out. But most every other night, they have refuel here on Sunday evenings. We have an amazing group of volunteers who invest in our teenagers here, and we love them and are grateful for that. But when you get them in your car, when you're picking them up and you're getting ready to take them home, ask them a couple of questions like, hey, how did it go? And what'd you learn? And they're going to say, it was fine and nothing, right? Because that's what teenagers say to everything that you ask. But there is something about that interaction and letting them know you care. Let them know that you want to know more. And who knows the conversation that could come from that. And so if you got teenagers, invest in them relationally, right? It's so important. Let them know that you have this interest. And again, as a church, we're going to come alongside you the best we can as you work to lead your kids, your teenagers, spiritually. Let me throw one other thing out, and this isn't connected to church. There is something about leading your kids relationally that is all about us as parents being open with our children. Kara and I, early on in our marriage, we said, hey, when we have kids, we want them to ask us questions. And so we told our kids at a young age, we said, you can ask us any question you want to ask us at any time. And we told them, we're like, there are no limits to those questions. And of course, you're like, well, hopefully, they don't ask you any hard questions. They've asked us some really hard questions. They've asked us questions about drugs and alcohol and sex and sexuality and politics and dating and marriage. And many times we were left red-faced. We're like, I don't know if we really want to answer that. But you said, no, we're going to answer that question. Because we don't want our kids learning about sex from their friend. We don't want our kids learning about sex from social media influencers. We want to be able to say, hey, you can ask us any question that you want to ask us, no matter how it makes us feel, because as a parent, we said, our job is to have this relationship with you as our child and to lead you spiritually. And by putting that guardrail in place, it gave us an opportunity to speak things about faith that our kids are not going to learn anywhere else. And maybe that's something you can try. Maybe that's something that's good for you. For us, it's been great. And again, we've had some hard conversations with our kids, but our kids know, and they still know to this day, that they can ask us anything. And it's because of that relationship we have with them that we get a chance to lead them and lead them spiritually and hopefully lead them to become closer to Jesus. There's so many other things I could add here about leading our children relationally. But as we go back to these words from Moses that we looked at today, if you want your kids to make God their leader, hey, parents, it starts with you. If you want them to grow spiritually, then parents, you've got to grow spiritually yourself. But none of this will take place if we don't have that relationship with them. Our job as a parent is to lead our children. So if I'm going to say anything controversial today, it's this. Parents, don't blame the school system for where your kids are in their faith. Don't blame social media influencers who are teaching them something antithetical to what you believe. If you're not growing in your faith, if you are not building this relationship with your children, if you're not pointing them to who Jesus is, because in the end, that is the ultimate gift we can give our kids. And you know what that does? It sets up guardrails for us as we're growing in our faith, but it also sets guardrails up for them as they traverse through their lives. What's that goal? Parents, our goal is to move our kids from dependence on us to dependence on God. And if we live this out like we talked about today, I truly believe we can get our children to that place of where in the end, their dependence, their life is focused on God.